The marble floors beneath my feet felt like ice as Margaret's voice cut through the estate's grand foyer. Every word dripped with a kind of venom that only family can perfect. You need to leave, now. I stood there, wedding ring still warm on my finger, watching my mother-in-law's perfectly manicured hand point toward the door like I was some unwanted pest. Behind her, Richard nodded with that same cold expression he'd worn at every family gathering for the past 3 years. My father-in-law had never liked me, but this felt different. This felt final. Margaret, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My voice barely echoed in the massive space, swallowed by crystal chandeliers and oil paintings worth more than most people's homes. She laughed. Actually laughed. The sound bounced off the walls like broken glass. The only misunderstanding was thinking you belonged here in the first place. My husband, James, stood behind them, silent as a tomb. 3 years of marriage and he couldn't even look at me. His shoulders were hunched forward like he was carrying the weight of the world, but he wouldn't meet my eyes, not once. James. I tried to reach him, but the distance between us felt infinite. Say something. He finally looked up, and I saw everything I needed to know. The man I'd married was gone, replaced by someone who looked exactly like him but had ice where his heart used to be. I think it's for the best, Sarah. This isn't working. 6 words. Our entire marriage reduced to 6 words. The estate stretched around us like a monument to everything I'd never belonged to. Persian rugs that cost more than cars. Furniture that had been in their family longer than some countries had existed. Windows that overlooked gardens designed by people whose names were in history books. And I was being thrown out like yesterday's trash. You have 30 minutes to pack your things. Richard's voice carried the authority of a man who'd never been told no in his life. Security will escort you out if necessary. Security? They were treating me like a criminal. My hands shook as I climbed the curved staircase to what had been our bedroom. Each step felt heavier than the last. The walls were lined with family portraits, generations of Blackwood wealth staring down at me with the same cold eyes I'd just faced downstairs. I'd never fit in those portraits anyway. The bedroom was exactly as I'd left it that morning. James's cologne still lingered in the air. My jewelry box sat on the vanity next to a photo from our honeymoon in Italy. We'd looked so happy then, so naive. I grabbed a suitcase from the walk-in closet, my hands moving automatically. Clothes, toiletries, the few personal items that actually belonged to me. Everything else was theirs. Everything had always been theirs. As I packed, fragments of conversations drifted back to me. Whispered remarks at dinner parties about my background. Comments about how I'd landed on my feet when I married James. The way they'd always introduce me as James's wife instead of using my name. I'd thought it would get better with time. I'd thought love would be enough. 28 minutes later, I stood in the foyer again with my single suitcase. Margaret was waiting, checking her diamond-encrusted watch with theatrical precision. Right on time. How refreshing. Through the massive windows, I could see the gardens where James and I had gotten married. 3 years ago, on what I'd thought was the happiest day of my life. The fountain where we'd shared our first dance as husband and wife sparkled in the afternoon sun. Before I go, I set down my suitcase and looked each of them in the eye. I want you to know something. Richard sighed like I was wasting his precious time. Make it quick. I know about the renovation loans. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't dismissive or cold. This was the kind of silence that comes right before thunder. Margaret's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup. I don't know what you're talking about. But I could see that she did. They all did. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been helping James organize some paperwork for his business. He'd been stressed about something, making phone calls late into the night and disappearing into his office for hours at a time. When I'd offered to help sort through the mountain of documents on his desk, he'd gratefully accepted. That's when I'd found the mortgage papers. The Blackwood estate, in all its intimidating glory, was mortgaged to the hilt. Worse than that, it was 3 months behind on payments. The family that had looked down on me for my modest background was drowning in debt. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was the series of loan documents stapled to the back of the mortgage papers. Personal loans, business loans, private investments. All of them keeping the estate afloat. All of them signed by someone the Blackwoods had apparently never bothered to research. All of them signed by me. You see, I continued, watching their faces carefully. I did some digging after I found those papers. Amazing what you can learn when you actually pay attention to the fine print. James finally spoke, his voice cracking slightly. Sarah, what are you talking about? Sterling Financial Solutions, ring any bells? Richard's face went from pale to gray. Margaret actually took a step backward. The investment firm that's been keeping this place running for the past 18 months? The one that bought out your mortgage when you defaulted? The one that's funded every renovation, every repair, every luxury you've enjoyed while treating me like hired help? My voice was getting stronger with every word. For 3 years, I'd whispered in this house. I'd made myself small, hoping they'd accept me. But there was no need to whisper anymore. I own Sterling Financial Solutions. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. I'd started Sterling 6 years ago, long before I'd met James, a small investment firm focused on real estate acquisitions and private lending. I'd built it from nothing, working 18-hour days and sleeping in my office more nights than I'd slept in my own bed. By the time James and I met at that coffee shop downtown, Sterling was managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But I'd kept my business separate from my personal life. I'd learned early on that money changed how people saw you, and I'd wanted James to fall in love with me, not my bank account. I'd been so naive. That's impossible, Margaret whispered. You're nobody. I was nobody, built something anyway. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had rejected me for not having money had been sustained by my money for over a year. Every time Richard had made a snide comment about my modest background, he'd been sitting in a chair paid for by my company. Every time Margaret had smiled that condescending smile, she'd been wearing jewelry purchased with loans I'd personally approved. When you defaulted on the estate mortgage, I continued, Sterling bought the debt from the bank. We've been your primary creditor ever since. Every payment you've made, every extension you've received, every dollar that's kept this place from being foreclosed on has come from me. James was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. In a way, I guess he hadn't. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was barely audible. Because I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I had. Clearly, that was expecting too much. The truth was more complicated than that, of course. I'd been burned before by people who'd only seen dollar signs when they looked at me. James had been different. He'd been kind, genuine, real, in a way that felt foreign after years of dealing with business sharks and social climbers. I'd thought if I could just prove myself to his family, if I could show them I was worthy of their son, then maybe we could build something real together. Something that wasn't about money or status or any of the superficial garbage that seemed to define their world. I'd been so incredibly wrong. The renovation on the East Wing? Sterling funded it. The new roof? Sterling. The landscaping, the pool house, the 3-car garage you built last spring. All of it, me. Richard was gripping the back of a chair so hard his knuckles had gone white. If this is true, then why are you here? Why marry James? Because I loved him. The words came out more bitter than I'd intended. Because I thought love mattered more than money. Apparently, in this family, I was wrong about that too. Margaret found her voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. What do you want? What I want is for the past 3 years to have been different. What I want is for my husband to have stood up for me at least once. What I want is to have been treated like a human being instead of an inconvenience. I picked up my suitcase again. The handle felt solid in my grip, real in a way nothing else in this house ever had. But since I can't have those things, I'll settle for this. You have 48 hours. 48 hours for what? James's voice was stronger now, with an edge that reminded me why I'd fallen for him in the first place. To decide how you want this to go. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope I'd prepared 2 weeks ago, right after I'd found those mortgage papers. Right after I'd realized exactly how precarious their situation really was. These are foreclosure papers. Sterling Financial Solutions is calling in all outstanding debts related to this property, effective immediately. The total amount owed, including interest and penalties, is $4.7 million. The number hit them like a physical blow. Margaret actually gasped. Richard stumbled backward and sat down hard in the nearest chair. "You can't do this," Margaret breathed. "This is our home." "Actually, I can. According to the terms of your loan agreements, full payment can be demanded at any time if certain conditions aren't met. Conditions like maintaining adequate insurance, keeping the property in good repair, and not using the estate as collateral for other debts." I'd studied those loan documents like they were scripture. Every clause, every provision, every legal loophole had been burned into my memory. "You violated at least 12 different terms of your agreements in the past 6 months alone. My lawyers have been documenting everything." "Sarah." James stepped forward, and for a moment I saw the man I'd married. The one who'd held me during thunderstorms and brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. "Please, we can work this out." "Can we? Because 30 minutes ago you threw me out of this house. You stood there and watched your parents humiliate me and you said nothing. You let them treat me like garbage and you said it was for the best." The hurt in his eyes almost broke my resolve. Almost. "I was scared, Sarah. They said things about you, about us. I didn't know what to believe." "What kind of things?" Margaret and Richard exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that comes from decades of marriage. Finally, Richard spoke. "We hired a private investigator." Of course they had. I'd wondered when this would surface. "3 months ago," he continued. "We wanted to know more about your background, your family, your finances." "And what did you find?" "Nothing." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "We found nothing. No family, no background, no history before you appeared in James's life. It was like you'd materialized out of thin air." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So because you couldn't find information about me, you assumed I was hiding something sinister. Weren't you?" Richard's voice had recovered some of its authority. "You've been lying to us for 3 years." "I've never lied to anyone. I just never volunteered information you never bothered to ask for." The truth was darker than they knew. There was no family to find because I'd spent most of my childhood in foster care. No background to trace because I'd aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a GED and a fierce determination to never be powerless again. I'd built Sterling from nothing because I'd had nothing to lose. I'd worked 18-hour days because I'd had nowhere else to go. I'd become successful because failure meant homelessness and I'd been homeless before. But they didn't need to know that story. They'd given up the right to know that story when they'd decided I wasn't worth fighting for. "You have 48 hours," I repeated. "You can pay the full amount and keep your home, or you can find alternative financing, or you can walk away and let Sterling take possession of the property." "There's a fourth option," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "We can contest this in court, prove that you married James under false pretenses, fraud maybe." I smiled, and I could see it unnerved her. It was the smile I'd perfected in boardrooms when opposing lawyers thought they could intimidate me. "Please do. I'd love to explain to a judge how you accepted millions of dollars in loans from my company while simultaneously treating me like a second-class citizen." I'd especially enjoy detailing the 18 separate occasions when Richard made derogatory comments about my background during family dinners. My lawyers have been documenting everything. They hadn't known about the documentation, but they should have. Sterling Financial didn't loan millions of dollars without extensive due diligence. Every conversation, every interaction, every snide comment had been recorded and filed away. Not because I'd planned this moment, but because I'd learned long ago that in business, everything eventually becomes evidence. "This is insane," James said. "We're married, Sarah. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours. Sterling belongs to both of us." "Actually, it doesn't. Sterling Financial Solutions was established 6 years ago, 3 years before we met. According to our prenuptial agreement, premarital assets remain separate property." His face went blank. "We don't have a prenuptial agreement." "We do. You signed it the week before our wedding. Your father insisted on it, remember? He said it would protect the family assets in case our marriage didn't work out. I watched the memory dawn on Richard's face. He'd been so focused on protecting the Blackwood fortune from my potential claims that he'd never considered I might have assets of my own to protect. The prenup he demanded to keep me away from their money had also kept them away from mine. That prenup works both ways, I continued. It means Sterling's assets can't be considered marital property, which means when I foreclose on this estate, you can't claim community property rights to stop me. Margaret was looking at Richard like he'd personally burned down everything she'd ever loved. You said the prenup would protect us. It was supposed to, he whispered. It did, just not the way you thought. I checked my watch. A habit I'd developed during my years building Sterling, when every minute represented potential profit or loss. I have other appointments today. You have until Thursday at 5 p.m. to decide. If I don't hear from you by then, I'll proceed with the foreclosure. Wait. James grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. His touch was familiar, warm in a way that made my chest tight. Don't do this, please. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. For a moment, I wavered. 3 years of marriage, of shared dreams and whispered promises, of building a life together that had felt real even when everything else felt fake. The way he looked at me now reminded me of our first date, when he'd been nervous and sweet and completely different from every other man I'd ever met. But then I looked over his shoulder at Margaret and Richard, and I saw the same cold calculation I'd been fighting against for 3 years. They weren't seeing me as a person even now. They were seeing me as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome. You had 3 years to fix this, James. 3 years to choose me over them. You never did. They're my family. I was supposed to be your family too. The words hung between us like a bridge burning down. I could see him trying to find something to say, some way to make this right, but we both knew it was too late for words. 48 hours, I said again, and walked out of the estate for what I thought would be the last time. My car was parked in the circular drive, looking modest and out of place among the marble columns and perfectly manicured hedges. A Honda Accord that I'd bought used and paid off early, back when every dollar mattered. I kept driving it even after Sterling made me wealthy because it reminded me where I'd come from, because it felt honest in a way that luxury cars didn't. Because it was mine, earned through work instead of inheritance or marriage or any of the other accidents of birth that seemed to define the Blackwood world. As I drove away from the estate, I caught a glimpse of it in my rearview mirror. Even in crisis, it looked majestic, imposing, permanent. The kind of place that had stood for generations and would stand for generations more. Except now it wouldn't, not for them. The next 24 hours passed like a fever dream. My phone rang constantly. James called 17 times before I finally turned it off. My lawyers called with updates on the foreclosure paperwork. My assistant called with questions about Sterling's other projects. I spent the day in my office downtown, a modest space on the 14th floor of a building that had seen better decades. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers here. Just functional furniture, financial documents, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city I'd learned to call home. Sterling Financial Solutions occupied half the floor, 12 employees, including myself. We specialized in real estate acquisitions and private lending, focusing on properties that banks considered too risky or unconventional for traditional financing. It was good work, honest work. We helped people who'd been overlooked by the traditional financial system, people whose situations were complicated or whose backgrounds didn't fit neat corporate boxes. People like me. I'd started Sterling because I'd understood what it felt like to be dismissed, to be considered unworthy of investment or trust. Every client we helped was a small victory against the system that had written me off before I'd even had a chance to fail. The Blackwood estate had been different. When their mortgage had come up for sale, I'd seen it as an opportunity to help the family I was marrying into. I'd convinced myself that by keeping them financially stable, I was protecting James from stress and preserving the home he'd grown up in. I'd been so naive. By Wednesday evening, I still hadn't heard from any of them. No calls, no emails, no desperate messages from James begging me to reconsider. Part of me had expected something. An apology maybe, some acknowledgement of what they'd done. But the silence was telling. They were probably meeting with lawyers, looking for loopholes, trying to find some way to escape the consequences of their own cruelty without actually addressing what they'd done wrong. It was exactly what I'd expected from them. Thursday morning brought rain. Heavy, persistent drops that turned the city gray and made everything feel heavier than it was. I sat in my office, watching water stream down the windows, and tried not to think about James. I'd loved him, really loved him, in a way that had surprised me after years of focusing solely on business. He'd been kind and funny and genuine, at least when we were alone. When it was just the two of us, away from his family's influence, he'd been everything I'd never known I wanted. But people aren't just who they are in isolation. They're also who they choose to be when it matters, when the stakes are high and they have to pick a side. James had picked his side 3 days ago in that marble foyer. He'd stood there and watched his parents tear me apart, and he'd chosen silence over courage, comfort over love. That choice had consequences. At 4:30 p.m., my assistant knocked on my office door. "Mrs. Blackwood, there's someone here to see you." I looked up from the foreclosure papers I'd been reviewing. "Send them in." But it wasn't James who walked through my door. It wasn't Margaret or Richard either. It was a woman I'd never seen before, mid-50s, professionally dressed, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive but practical. She had the kind of confidence that comes from winning battles people never hear about. "Mrs. Blackwood, my name is Patricia Chen. I represent the Blackwood family." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Have a seat, though I should mention, you have about 25 minutes before my deadline expires." She sat down and opened her briefcase with deliberate precision. "My clients would like to resolve this matter without involving the courts." "I'm listening." "They're prepared to offer you a settlement, $2 million in exchange for restructuring the loan terms and removing yourself permanently from their lives." I leaned back in my chair and studied her. She had intelligent eyes and careful hands, the kind of lawyer who'd built her reputation on making impossible situations disappear quietly. "That's an interesting offer. Unfortunately, it's also less than half of what they actually owe. It's more than you'd likely recover in a foreclosure sale after legal fees and court costs." She wasn't wrong about that, but she was missing the point entirely. "Miss Chen, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you ever been married?" She looked surprised by the question. "I have. 15 years this September." "And if your spouse's family treated you like garbage for years, humiliated you in your own home, and then threw you out like trash while your husband watched silently, how much would someone have to pay you to just forget about it?" Her expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you're hurt, but sometimes the best revenge is walking away with your dignity intact." I walked away with my dignity 3 days ago. This isn't about revenge, this is about consequences. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain was getting heavier, turning the streets below into rivers of reflected light. "Do you know what I did before I started Sterling Financial Solutions?" "No, ma'am." "I survived. That was my full-time job for the first 25 years of my life. Just surviving. Foster care, group homes, aging out of the system with nothing but a high school education and a lot of anger." I turned back to face her. "I built this company because I wanted to prove that where you come from doesn't determine where you end up. That hard work and intelligence matter more than family connections or inherited privilege. And you've certainly done that." "Have I?" Because 3 days ago, the family I married into looked at everything I'd accomplished and decided it wasn't enough. They looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong, someone beneath their station, someone worthy of contempt. Miss Chen was taking notes now, her pen moving quickly across a legal pad. "They took my money for over a year while treating me like hired help. They accepted my help while rejecting me as a person. They used me while dismissing me." I walked back to my desk and sat down. "So no, Miss Chen, $2 million isn't enough. There isn't enough money in the world to buy my silence about this. There isn't enough money to make me forget how they treated me. And there certainly isn't enough money to convince me to let them escape the consequences of their own choices. She closed her notepad and looked at me with something that might have been respect. What would be enough? Nothing. That's what you're not understanding. This isn't a negotiation. This is a reckoning. Mrs. Blackwood, please consider the implications of what you're doing. This will destroy their lives. They should have considered that before they destroyed mine. At exactly 5 p.m., I signed the foreclosure order. 3 weeks later, I stood in the estate's foyer again. But this time, I wasn't being thrown out. This time, I was the owner. The foreclosure had proceeded faster than anyone expected. The Blackwoods had tried several legal challenges, all of which had failed. They'd attempted to secure alternative financing, but their credit history and existing debt load had made them unbankable. In the end, they'd had 7 days to vacate the premises. James had called me on the final day. His voice had been hollow, defeated in a way that made my chest ache despite everything. "Sarah, please, we can work something out. I know I was wrong. I know I should have stood up for you. But this is too much. You're destroying my family." "Your family destroyed itself, James. I'm just holding them accountable for it." "What happened to the woman I married? The one who believed in forgiveness and second chances?" "She learned that forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and second chances should go to people who've earned them, not people who demand them." "We'll have nowhere to go." That had been the moment that almost broke me, because despite everything, I still loved him. Despite the betrayal and the humiliation and the years of being treated like an intruder in my own marriage, I still cared about his pain. But caring about someone's pain doesn't mean you're obligated to prevent the consequences of their choices. "You'll figure it out," I'd said. "You're Blackwoods, you always land on your feet." Now I was walking through rooms that had once felt like foreign territory. The same Persian rugs, the same crystal chandeliers, the same oil paintings of ancestors who'd never accepted me as family. But everything felt different now, smaller, somehow, less intimidating. I'd hired a property management company to handle the practical aspects of ownership. The estate would be converted into event space, available for weddings and corporate functions. The gardens James and I had been married in would host other couples' happiest days. There was poetry in that, though I wasn't sure if it was beautiful or tragic. I found myself in what had been our bedroom. The room was empty now, stripped of all personal belongings. Just furniture and space and memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. My phone rang, an unknown number, but I recognized James's voice immediately. "Sarah, it's me." "I know. I'm calling from my new apartment. It's small but it's decent. Margaret and Richard are staying with her sister in Connecticut until they figure out their next move." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. "I wanted you to know that I understand now why you did what you did. I've had time to think about it, about how we treated you, about how I let them treat you." "James, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I understand I failed you. As a husband, as a partner, as a person who was supposed to love you more than anyone else in the world." The words I'd waited 3 years to hear. Too late now, but still meaningful in their way. "Thank you for saying that. For what it's worth, I do love you, I always did. I just didn't know how to choose you over everything I'd grown up believing was important. I know you did, that's what made this so hard. If I could go back and do it differently." "But you can't." "No, I can't." We sat in silence for a long moment, connected by phone lines and shared history and all the words we'd never learned to say when they mattered. "Are you happy now?" he asked finally. "Having the house, getting your revenge?" I looked around the empty bedroom, thinking about his question. "I'm not happy, James, but I'm not destroyed either. And for a while there, I thought I might be." "What will you do now?" "Keep building Sterling. Keep helping people who need second chances. Keep proving that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go." "And us?" "There is no us anymore. There hasn't been for a while." Another silence. Then, "I'm sorry, Sarah, for all of it. For not being the man you deserved. For not fighting harder. For letting them hurt you." "I'm sorry, too, for letting it get this far. for not walking away sooner, for thinking I could change people who didn't want to be changed. Maybe we were both trying to be people we weren't. Maybe. Goodbye, Sarah. Goodbye, James. After I hung up, I sat in the empty room for a long time, thinking about the strange turns life takes. 3 years ago, I'd walked into this house as a hopeful bride, ready to build a life with someone I loved. Today, I'd walked in as the owner of everything that had once made me feel small. But ownership wasn't the victory I'd thought it would be. Having the house didn't erase the pain of being rejected by it. Having power didn't heal the wounds left by powerlessness. What it did do was prove a point, not to them, but to myself. It proved that I was stronger than their rejection, that my worth wasn't determined by their acceptance, that I could survive their cruelty and come out the other side still standing. As I left the estate that evening, I passed the fountain where James and I had shared our first dance as husband and wife. The water was still sparkling in the setting sun, still beautiful, still peaceful. But it belonged to me now, all of it, the beauty and the pain, the memories and the possibilities. I'd won, but like most victories that matter, it tasted more like loss than triumph. 3 months later, Sterling Financial Solutions moved to a larger office building downtown. We'd grown to 22 employees, and our client list had expanded to include projects in 6 different states. The Blackwood estate had been featured in 3 wedding magazines as a premier event venue. It was booked solid for the next 18 months. I hadn't seen or heard from James since that final phone call. According to public records, he'd started a small consulting firm and was living quietly in a modest apartment across town. Margaret and Richard had moved to Florida permanently, where they were renting a small condo and learning to live on Social Security. I told myself I didn't care about their circumstances. Mostly, that was even true. But late at night, when I was alone in my own apartment, I sometimes wondered if there had been another way, some path that could have led to understanding instead of destruction, healing instead of revenge. I'd never know, and maybe that was the point. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some choices, once made, can never be unmade. All you can do is live with the consequences and try to build something better from the ashes. On a rainy Thursday evening, almost exactly 1 year after the confrontation in the estate's foyer, I was working late in my office when my assistant knocked on the door. "Mrs. Blackwood, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." I looked up from the loan proposal I'd been reviewing. "Send her in." The woman who walked through my door was elegantly dressed but tired-looking. She had James's eyes and the kind of posture that spoke of old money and older pain. Margaret Blackwood looked smaller than I remembered, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with her physical size. She sat down across from my desk without being invited, the way she'd done everything else in the years I'd known her. "Hello, Sarah." "Margaret, this is unexpected." "I imagine it is." We studied each other across the desk that separated us. A year of consequences written in the lines around her eyes, the careful way she held herself, the absence of the jewelry that had once adorned her like armor. "How can I help you?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You can't. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here?" "To apologize." The words hung between us like something fragile. I'd imagined this moment many times over the past year, but now that it was happening, I wasn't sure what to feel. "Go on." "I was wrong. About you, about what you meant to James, about what kind of person you were. I was cruel and petty and prejudiced, and I destroyed my son's happiness because of it." Her voice was steady, but I could see the effort it took to maintain that steadiness. "I spent 63 years believing that certain things mattered. Bloodlines and social standing and the right kind of background. I based my entire sense of worth on those things, and I treated anyone who didn't fit that narrow definition as lesser." She looked around my office, taking in the modest furnishings and practical decor. "I was too stupid and too proud to see that you'd built something real, something meaningful, something that mattered more than any of the arbitrary markers I'd used to judge people my entire life." "Margaret, let me finish, please. I may not get another chance to say this." I nodded. "Richard is gone. He had a heart attack 6 weeks ago. The stress, the doctor said. The humiliation of losing everything, of being wrong about everything. It killed him as surely as if someone had put a gun to his head. I felt a stab of unexpected grief. Richard had never been kind to me, but he'd been James's father. He'd been part of the family I'd tried so hard to join. I'm sorry for your loss. Are you, really? Yes. I didn't want anyone to die, Margaret. I just wanted to be treated with basic human dignity. I know. That's what makes this so much worse. We could have had that. We could have had a daughter who loved our son, who made him happy, who brought something valuable to our family. Instead, we threw it away because we were too blind to see what we had. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. James asked me to give this to you. He's too ashamed to come himself. I took the package but didn't open it. How is he? Broken. He blames himself for Richard's death, for the divorce, for losing you. He's working 18-hour days trying to build something from nothing, just like you did. I think he's trying to prove something to himself. Or trying to punish himself. Maybe both. I unwrapped the package. Inside was a small jewelry box, and inside that was my grandmother's ring. The only thing I'd inherited from my family before they died in the accident that had sent me into foster care. I'd given it to James on our first anniversary, telling him it was the most valuable thing I owned. He said to tell you he understands now what it means to lose everything that matters, and that he wants you to have this back because it belongs to someone who's strong enough to rebuild from nothing. My throat felt tight. And what about you? What will you do now? Live with the consequences of my choices. Try to become a better person in whatever time I have left. Hope that someday, somehow, James can forgive me for destroying the best thing that ever happened to him. She stood up, moving carefully like someone who'd aged years in months. I don't expect you to forgive me, Sarah. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I did. I understand what I cost all of us, and I'm sorry. She turned toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, you were the daughter I never knew I wanted. You challenged me, you made me think, you forced me to question things I'd never questioned before. I was too proud and stupid to appreciate that when it mattered. Margaret. She turned back to me. I forgive you. The words surprised me as much as they surprised her. But they felt right, like something I'd been carrying that I was finally ready to put down. She started to cry then, silently, tears streaming down her face without sound. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. After she left, I sat in my office holding my grandmother's ring and thinking about the strange geometry of forgiveness. How it wasn't about forgetting or excusing or pretending things hadn't happened. How it was about choosing to carry love instead of hate, hope instead of bitterness. I'd won my war with the Blackwood family. I'd proven my point, exacted my revenge, shown them the consequences of their cruelty. But winning hadn't been the victory I'd thought it would be. It had been necessary, maybe, but it hadn't healed the wound they'd left. It had only proven that I was strong enough to survive it. Forgiveness was different. Forgiveness was choosing to heal instead of choosing to hurt. It was deciding that their judgment of me mattered less than my judgment of myself. It was freedom. I put my grandmother's ring back in its box and placed it in my desk drawer, next to the fountain pen I'd used to sign the foreclosure order a year ago. Both of them were part of my story now. The hurt and the healing, the destruction and the rebuilding, the ending of one thing, and the beginning of something else. Outside my window, the city sparkled in the evening light. Millions of people living their lives, making their choices, building their futures one decision at a time. Tomorrow, Sterling Financial Solutions would approve 3 new loans. We'd help a young couple buy their first house, finance a restaurant expansion for an immigrant family, and provide bridge funding for a nonprofit that helped teenagers aging out of foster care. Real help for real people trying to build real lives. That felt like victory. That felt like triumph. That felt like coming home.